Thank you so much for being back for SusTalk number 3. Today we have Clementine Chambon, and she is our mafioso for the Energy and Agriculture Nexus. Clementine is the CTO and co-founder of Oorja Development Solutions, a really cool company that works mostly in rural India. And I think, if I'm not wrong, focused on eastern states in India. But you live in London and you work out of Delhi, so you're back and forth quite a bit. I am super excited for this talk. I'll hand it over to you, Clementine, and post your talk, we'll have a 30-minute Q&A.
Sounds good. So thank you so much for having me and allowing me to talk about one of my favorite topics. So yeah, thanks for the intro, Ani. So like he said, my name is Clementine, and today I'll be talking about the energy and agricultural nexus. So that's sounding very, obviously it's core to the sustainability challenge, but like I hope you'll see, it's ultimately much bigger than that. It's more to do with the social and economic and sort of equity challenge around that topic. So a little bit about me. My background is in chemical engineering. I studied that because I wanted to have an impact on sustainability right from the beginning. And then I did a PhD in biofuels. So I basically spent 3-4 years in the lab cooking different types of agricultural waste and wood and trying to make cost-effective bioethanol and other fuels out of it. So right at the beginning of that journey, in about 2014, as a sort of side project to my PhD, I did a five-week summer school, which is called Climate Kick or Climate KIC. And that's actually where I met someone who became my business partner called Amit Sarangi. And so back then we didn't co-found the company, but we came up with the seed concept for what has now become Oorja, which is the organization that we run together. So Oorja is a mission-driven company. We work at this intersection between energy and agriculture, and we focus on powering livelihood appliances. So that's all, again, sounding quite theoretical. So what is our mission? Well, I'll show you the slides. Our mission has 3 sort of core aims to it. The first is to combat energy poverty, which is something that I'll go into in more detail shortly. The second is to use energy as a catalyst for economic development, for job creation, and for improvement of living standards. And then, of course, central to all of this still is, but I'm putting it third for a good reason, which you'll see, is combating climate change. And so these are the sort of 3 core elements of our mission, and I hope you'll see how those sort of all fit together. So like I said, today we'll be talking about this intersection between energy access, agriculture, livelihoods, and sustainability. So in order to begin, I think it makes sense to start with SDG number 7, which is one of the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN set for 2030. So I guess you'll all be familiar with those goals, but just to, again, explicitly, what is SDG 7? It is to bring universal access to energy to everyone on the planet by the year 2030. So just 10 years left. And so yeah, when we talk about energy, what does that mean? Well, you can understand it in terms of there's 2 main components to it. The first is electricity, which is what we normally think about when we talk about energy. So just about 1 billion people on the planet today still don't have access to electricity at all in any form. Instead, they rely on fossil fuels. So mainly they rely on diesel, like this diesel lamp you can see here. And mainly they rely on kerosene, like kerosene lamps, which are mostly burned indoors and are responsible for generating a huge amount of particulate matter that's breathed in, mostly by women and children who sit near them, and therefore results in a lot of health issues, in addition to obviously being a very poor lighting source. So that's on the energy side. And of course, there are other forms of energy that people rely on for like diesel for commercial power and for agriculture. Those are the sort of, incumbent energy fuels for people who don't have access to a national grid. And then the other side of it, which I'll just mention briefly because it's often overlooked, but it's still part of the energy access challenge. And that's access to clean cooking. So this is actually a much bigger problem than in terms of number of people. So something like 3 billion people rely on either biomass fuels or other solid fuels for cooking when there are obviously much cleaner alternatives available. And that again has huge, health impact. So those are the 2 main, the components of energy access, so electricity and cooking. So I'm going to focus mostly on electricity. So if you wanted to understand, what is the scale of this actual problem, the scale of the SDG challenge in terms of numbers for people who like numbers, although like I'll show you, it's more about lives and how lives are affected. But from a sort of economic perspective, the International Energy Agency estimates that it would cost us about $52 billion per year if we want to solve or achieve universal electrification by the year 2030. So $52 billion per year for the clean electricity side of it, and about $5 billion per year for the clean cooking challenge. So those are honestly not huge, investments that are required, about 0.2% of global GDP. And like we saw, those are about a third of the population who would be benefited from those. So that's the kind of scale of the SDG challenge. So let's look a little bit more about who are these people and how do we go about in solving their energy access challenges. So what I didn't mention is that about 80% of people who still don't have access to adequate fuels or energy are in rural areas, and that's mostly in sub-Saharan Africa and also in India. And India actually has the largest population in a single country that faces these challenges. So what I told you before was about the global context, and in the rest of my talk, I'll be focusing on the Indian context only. So to understand these rural energy consumers, you need to understand a bit more about the farm economy. So broadly, India's rural economy is split into the farm sector and the non-farm sector. So even though the farm sector brings a smaller proportion to GDP, it's actually a much bigger sustainer of livelihoods. About 70% of the population is supported by the farm economy across the entire country. And that's either for sustenance, so for food, or for income. Now, about 85% of farms are small and marginal. So that means that the vast majority of farmers have fewer than 2 hectares of land holding. So these are very small land holdings, and they're essentially unviable. They produce enough just about enough for a family, but they're not, enough for generating a good quality of life. And that's why most of these farmers are forced to sustain themselves through daily wage labor and through other forms of income that they can get so that they can supplement their income from agriculture. And in many cases, they might also be making a loss from agriculture. So we'll look more closely at what they need from an energy perspective in a minute. But I wanted to also talk about how the COVID pandemic has highlighted the key role that these people play in the economy. So as we all know, across the world, things have been shut down for a number of weeks and months now. In India as well, from 25th March onwards, the entire country was brought to a halt, and that included farmers. So they were forced to stay home. They weren't able to go leave their villages for earning daily wage labor. And the agricultural value chain, was completely disrupted. So the harvesting of crops was on hold, and it took a while for things to get back up and running again. And of course, because so many people's lives depend on this, at some point, I think in early May, agriculture was, classed as essential, and so therefore most of these activities were exempt, which means that laborers could go back to work, and the Rabi harvest, which was due at that time, was able to get completed with some delay. So things like wheat and pulses were able to get harvested, and so yeah, the farm economy was able to start itself up again. But this this pandemic, obviously, in the way that it shut down the lifeline, not only for those farmers and laborers, but also for the country, because they supply food to the entire country. It sort of highlighted how essential they are to the entire economy and how important it is that they are protected, because they're also extremely vulnerable. They're vulnerable to malnutrition, they're vulnerable to hunger, and it's very easy to cut off their lifelines, and they are so essential to the economy. So now we'll go into a little bit more detail about how do these rural consumers actually use energy, and how is the poverty challenge interlinked with that. So yeah, like I said, in terms of uses of energy, I'll just skip that slide. We can understand it in terms of the farm, like on farm and off farm. So on farm, kind of obvious, what do you do on farm? Well, one of the main uses of energy is in irrigation. So this is a huge sustainability challenge, but also a challenge for increasing agricultural productivity. So only about half of arable land in India is irrigated. The rest is obviously rain-fed. And close to 1 crore, so basically around 9 million diesel-based pumps are used across the country. Mostly these are in the northern and eastern states, which don't have access to agricultural feeders. So basically farmers, instead of using electric pumps, still use diesel-based pumps. So for anyone who's seen a diesel-based pump or a diesel engine of any sort, you know how it works. You basically just feed diesel into it and it produces a huge amount of noise and smoke, and then it will do whatever it's meant to do. So there's a lot of challenges with these, which I'll go into shortly, but one sort of key fact that is useful to remember is that these pumps, so this is just in irrigation, they're responsible for about 5% of India's diesel consumption. So just think about that. That's, billions of liters of diesel that are consumed every year. And obviously there's a huge expense associated with that, especially because diesel prices were deregulated a few years ago, but also a huge carbon footprint. So that's irrigation. Then we have other sectors that are also farm related, like agro processing. So for example, flour mills. They're only about, I think about 2% of SMEs are flour mills, but they consume something like 40% of all of India's rural energy demand. And again, a lot of that is diesel driven. Because of the erratic grid supply, it's preferable to have at least a fairly reliable diesel engine that's able to power machinery as opposed to having, constant power cuts. So with both of these incumbent sources, which are diesel powered, you have the same problems that you can sort of categorize. So firstly, like I said, high recurring expense, not only for fuel, but also for maintenance, because diesel engines have a lot of moving parts. And so they need to be repaired all the time. And that, adds up to their total running cost. They also are heavy and often need to be dragged places. So it results in quite a lot of drudgery, basically the labor of having to drag it. Then there are social and economic consequences as well, because you might not be able to afford energy all the times that you need it. So with irrigation, for example, farmers aren't able to irrigate all the time, and they also face additional problems with groundwater depletion, which means that ultimately their crop yields are remaining low. And finally, we have obviously the carbon footprint and this huge environmental impact associated with these sources of energy. So still in the farm sector, then we have other applications of energy which might not be met at all today. And a good example of those is the cold chain. So although this photo is actually from an urban mandi, but you can see, we all know the situation of, vegetables and fruits don't always have, most of the time there are no cold storage facilities available for farmers. So things have to be sold immediately after harvest, and it forces them to make a distress sale. So they're just not able to get the revenues that they should be able to get from their produce. And a huge amount of produce goes to waste. So it's estimated that about 30% of all the fresh produce across the country gets wasted, which is just incredible and astonishing. I'm not saying all of that is to do with what happens between the farm and fork, but it might also be at the consumer level. But a lot of that is also to do with lack of cold storage facilities. So yeah, these are some of the farm-related uses of energy. Of course, there are others as well to do with things like harvesting machinery and threshing. But yeah, those are some of the sort of ones that I wanted to highlight. And then coming to the non-farm uses of energy. So here we have things like cottage industries, like hand looms, tailoring, handicrafts. And then you have other, rural SMEs that are also essential, even things like printing shops or those are other energy uses in rural areas. And then, of course, although these are, I've barely mentioned these, but this is obviously huge, as we've seen, now because of this pandemic, and generally speaking. But energy is essential for healthcare as well and education. So to be able to power machines used from ventilators, whether it's ventilators or just very simple machinery, those all require energy. So those are some of the uses of energy in rural areas. So coming to some solutions. So this is obviously a huge topic, and I'm going to be focusing on the decentralized energy aspect of it. But so realistically, broadly speaking, we will need a range of different technologies to be able to provide solutions to these energy challenges. So some of these will still be powered by the grid. The grid obviously has a big role to play and is, the predominant source of energy in urban areas at least, and peri-urban areas. But decentralized energy, which basically means it's not reliant on the national grid network, have a really big role to play. And that's, if you look at it from a, speed, like how quickly can you get this done? It's generally faster to roll out decentralized energy systems than it is to plan very large centralized power stations and distribution networks. Secondly, from a cost perspective, it's often more cost effective as well. And thirdly, from a carbon perspective, it's, you can't have a small decentralized coal-fired power station. So they tend to be, much heavier on the renewables. Um, so that's why these decentralized renewable energy systems, or DRE systems, have a huge role to play. So coming to some of the technologies that will underpin this transition. So there are many that everyone will be familiar with. So the most obvious is PV, so solar PV, which has come down in cost by about 80% or so in the last decade. And that makes a dramatic difference because, as we discussed before, a lot of the people still lacking access to sufficient energy are low-income consumers. Then there are other things like microinverters that have enabled, much smaller and flexible sizing of solar arrays. And then, of course, battery storage. So yeah, again, you've seen similar trends in terms of those coming down in cost, particularly higher energy density and less toxic materials like lithium and sodium. But still, that's a big challenge for the energy access sector today, is more cheaper sources of storage, as we know. Then there's something called mini grids. So mini grids have always been forecast as having a big role to play. These are basically miniature energy networks that can cover, for example, a whole village or a small community. They are very different from the sort of individual solar systems that you've seen. So, we've all seen things like solar lights or very small solar panels that are used for individual shops or homes. But mini grids can cater also to the community loads or the productive loads, so commercial, agricultural loads. And yes, like I said, they've been forecast to have a huge role to play. But that's been very challenging, partly because they're very difficult to finance. You need to be able to predict people's demand accurately and then, come up with what's the most cost-effective combination of energy generation and storage and also distribution systems for these. But they still are expected to fill a big part of the gap in bringing energy to consumers the most cheap way. Then coming to some other technologies, so we have things like smart meters. We have mobile and digital platforms that are now, so that customers can make mobile payments, for example. We have, smart meters to enable you to effectively monitor and control all of these different decentralized assets. Another sort of disrupting element, which is not talked about as often as I think it should be, is energy efficient appliances. So particularly when you're looking at livelihoods, you need an appliance that can consume the least amount so that you can also size your energy generation system to be, as small and cheap as possible. So in the irrigation sector, for example, you look at brushless DC motors or BLDC motors, which are generally more efficient than, the AC motors that have been used more conventionally. And of course, there's a lot of, innovation that's happened in this space recently, which has made these come down in cost a lot. And again, saving on the cost you need to get these to more people. I thought I'd briefly mention as well in the cooking sector. So we have things like LPG stoves. So LPG, as we know, is obviously a fossil fuel, but it does emit 50 times less pollutants than the sort of classic biomass-based chulas that you see used all across the country. So in some cases, the most cost-effective solution is actually still fossil fuel-based. So yeah, overall, the trends that we're seeing are the 3Ds, which I guess many people in the energy sector will be familiar with. So decentralization, moving to smaller systems that are not dependent on huge infrastructure, digitalization so that we can control assets remotely, and decarbonization so that we move towards renewables. So yeah, people often like to ask, I'd like to innovate in this sector in terms of technologies. What new technologies do we need to solve the problem? But honestly, I don't think we have a technology problem. There are obviously improvements to be made in terms of how things are designed and in terms of quality that needs to be assured. But I think it's more to do with distribution as a challenge. And technology is really just an enabling force. And most of those technologies we already have to our disposal. They're just not getting into the hands of people who really need them. So coming to some delivery models. So Yeah, like I said, technology can only really be useful if it's in the hands of the right people. So how do you get it to them? So here, a good example comes from the irrigation sector. So we know that solar is a more cost-effective source of irrigation if you compare it to diesel. So over the life cycle of a solar asset, it will pay itself back in about 2 to 3 years, whereas diesel pumps are just much more expensive operationally. So they're cheap when you buy them, but then they have huge running cost. Um, so, one solution to that might be, okay, well, get a solar pump for every single farmer in the country and move those 10 million diesel-based pumps and replace them with solar pumps. So that's been the objective of the government for, I think, about 6 years now. The most recent version of the scheme for solar pump subsidies is called Kusum. And the way it works is that depending on the state, you can get between 70 to 90% of the solar pump finance upfront. But so that obviously is, huge. But obviously, as always, there are, some limitations in how that actually works. So like I said, the majority of these farmers are smallholders, so they have very small land holdings. They can't afford to pay something like 20, 30K upfront. That doesn't happen for them. They also often aren't aware of this scheme. There aren't any provisions for operations and maintenance. Once it's installed, if something goes wrong, how does that get fixed? They might not have the social capital to be able to access a subsidy scheme in the first place. So those are some reasons why uptake for this Kusum scheme and the various predecessors that it had are very low. And you still see, I think fewer than 1 million solar pumps have been deployed across the country. So, still a long way to go. And that's why it's important to have business models and delivery models that are sort of pro-poor, or at least accessible to the poor. So that means that they need to be economically accessible. So I'll just give an example from Oorja's work. To take a step back, so when we started Oorja with Amit, we had our mission to bring clean energy access to rural populations, and we spent a lot of time understanding household energy needs. So we actually built a system as well to power households and provide them with lighting and phone charging and fans. But then it was actually these were low-income rural households, the farmers themselves from those households, who asked us instead to develop a solution to the irrigation problem that they were facing. So we dug a bit deeper and we realized, that's where they're actually spending all of their income. So they spend, a significant proportion of their income on diesel for irrigation. And we identified this as one of the key market segments. And as it turns out, solar pumps are actually one of the most mature technologies that we have to replace, incumbent diesel use. So what we do now is we have this model which we call Unnati, and we finance and install the system. So, that's on the company's books for now. And then we operate and maintain them, and we sell energy as a service. So we sell water as a commodity, essentially. And what we do is so these are all smallholders. So we sign up groups of farmers with adjoining land. So they have about 30 acres or so of land that about 15 to 20 farmers own, sort of all next to each other. And we install a solar pump in the center of that field and sell water to them. And it works on a pay-per-use model. So they just pay according to how much they consume. And that means that there's no technology cost for acquisition. So there's no upfront cost to them. And this model has been working really well. We've been scaling it out. So we started in UP, we scaled it up to Assam. Now we're scaling out in other regions as well. So we've seen a lot of uptake from farmers who've been able to transition from diesel to solar. And it has various benefits. So not only saving them about 20% compared to what they spend on diesel, which is obviously a big saving, but also year-round availability, because a lot of diesel pumps aren't able to draw water when the groundwater levels drop, just before the monsoon. So basically about now would be the lowest water levels they would face. So they end up missing out on entire agricultural seasons because of that. So this is an example of a pay-per-use business model that is accessible to any farmer because there is no upfront technology cost and they're able to just save money. Overall, we know now that the farm sector is clearly in need of investment in modern energy technology. What does that really look like? What does success look like by 2030? So this is a big question. It is ultimately about an access problem and an equity problem, so that the communities that are the most disadvantaged at the moment are the ones that are, historically disadvantaged, and we've seen that now during the COVID pandemic of who's been the ones who've really suffered most. So it's rural populations, but within those rural populations, it's low-income communities and also minorities. So whether those are religious minorities or ethnic minorities or Dalits or tribal populations, so those are the ones who historically have been left out and who continue to be left out, and therefore the ones that need to be prioritized when we design energy solutions. So from an economic perspective, what does success look like? Well, essentially, energy infrastructure that we invest in should be able to generate local employment and should be able to generate additional income for the user. So that's why we focus on what's called productive energy, where it can be used to increase someone's income. So, for example, with a solar pump, if someone is able to, irrigate their field more adequately, they can increase their crop yields. They can also grow other crops they couldn't grow before, extending into new cultivation seasons. And ultimately, they can earn more income from a given piece of land. And that also makes them more resilient to climate shocks or to economic shocks or any sort of change in the situation. So broadly speaking, the DRE sector, the decentralized renewable energy sector, it already contributes a huge amount to the economy. I mean, supplies about 10 million people with energy today and brings nearly 100,000 jobs. But it can obviously grow a lot bigger than that if it had more investment. So ultimately, expanding energy infrastructure where it needs to go would also have a big impact on poverty alleviation. So it would reduce expenditure on fuel. It would enable people to participate in other economic activities locally. So it would bring jobs. And yeah, it would essentially accelerate the development of entire regions. Second, it would have a huge impact on human development. So I just wanted to highlight here this sort of interdependence of the Sustainable Development Goals. So if you look at SDG 7, which is affordable and clean energy, and it's actually over here towards the bottom right of this sphere, these are all the other 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So here we've highlighted some of the main links between the SDGs. So for example, having access to clean energy will improve health and well-being because you're reducing dependence on polluting fuels. It will reduce hunger. So it has a lot of knock-on effects, and it's kind of, you can see it as a golden thread that kind of weaves together all these other SDGs. And it's essential, for example, for enabling quality healthcare and education. So whether it's refrigerating vaccines or lighting up operating theaters or powering incubators and other equipment, and in schools, giving access to computers and lab equipment, and ultimately has a big impact on quality of life. Of course, there's also a big gender angle to this in terms of, the people who bear the brunt of the crappiest and dirtiest and most expensive sources of energy are largely women. And you see that more in cooking, of course. So yeah, it has a lot of knock-on effects. Yeah, and last but not least, of course, if we do this right, so a lot of people ask, is extending energy access to everyone on the planet compatible with a clean energy transition? Well, yeah, the answer is yes. So yeah, about 2.5 billion people rely on, polluting fuels like kerosene, diesel, and biomass fuels. So I mean, the most basic form of biomass fuels, not the more advanced. But yeah, an incomplete combustion of those releases a huge amount of black carbon, which is the second largest man-made driver of climate change. So in fact, it's necessary for the clean energy transition to move away from those fuels. But in order to do that, like I've emphasized, we really need to focus on the last mile and those who have been historically deprived. So yeah, just to close, some positive facts on this, how if we do actually achieve this. So about 75% of the extra capacity we need to deploy in order to reach SDG 7 is renewable. So some of that will be decentralized and some of it will be extensions to, for example, solar or wind to feed into the grid. It's also the least cost pathway that, that will help us achieve our climate goals. So decarbonizing is usually cheaper and faster to deploy in many regions. And so, yeah, hopefully the people at the International Energy Agency have done the math and they've come up with, so if we actually do achieve SDG 7 under the cheapest pathway, we'll only be emitting like net about 70 million tons per year more of carbon, which is nothing compared to, how much the global emissions are, which is about 0.2% actually. And if we also wanted to solve the clean cooking problem, then that has a net saving of 165 million tons. So, net actually, we wouldn't have any, greater carbon emission than we do today if we actually extend that to a lot more people. So, and of course, I haven't, discussed at all about our use of energy. People like us in cities have obviously a complete, very different energy scenarios. So there's obviously savings to be made there. So yeah, overall, I hope, I've helped you see a little bit about how solving the energy access challenge will be able, help us to basically boost rural livelihoods, be more effective in crisis response, and generally, move the entire economy over to a more sustainable and equitable system. So just to close, one of your slides was asking for how I would spend $100 million to make the world a more sustainable place. Well, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of, unpacking to do in a statement like this. Firstly, I think we should have a goal to prevent people like Jeff Bezos from being able to have this much resources that they can decide on the development of the future. So one of my priorities would be to prevent people like Jeff Bezos from being able to exist in the first place, or at least prevent him from becoming a trillionaire. But yeah, I don't think I would actually spend it on sustainability, or at least I would spend it on, especially as we've seen, and we all know now, the extreme inequity of the world that we live in, and I think it would make more sense to spend that in addressing the racial, religious, and economic divides that still mean that we live in such a world. So yeah, that's how I'd like to close. And I will be very happy to answer any questions that you guys might have on. Yeah, thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Clementine. That was really, really, really interesting.